Everybody, it's Anthony Brogdon, your main man. I'm jamming today. I got one of them PhD dudes on the show. Man, this brother, let me tell you something. When he wrote the dissertation, they said we ain't got to read it. Just come on over here. You are prolific already, young man. And here we are on Strong Inspirations, where I find these people somehow. And let me say something. Somehow I'm jamming because they kind of vet me. They wonder who I am. This is one of those guys that he don't just do this ordinarily because he's a heavyweight in his own right? But he wants you to hear it first, and as I like to call, straight, no chasing. We don't play with you. We're going to give it to you to intoxicate your mind, not DUI, so that when you get and understand what he and the questions that I ask are saying, you stagger because it's the truth. So hit the subscribe button on Strong Inspirations. It's free, my friends. I don't want to charge for this. I love doing this. I'm over 3 years going on 4th year anniversary. Over 600 videos from people around the world. I'm a better person from this. I ain't got to charge for this. I want y'all to be better like I am. I've even had a few people cry. Now they cried, I cried. Like the last guy, he came on, he said, man, the Lord blessed him because he was on his way to death. He had stage 4 cancer. And as a result of that, he gives up his life to help other people. And one of the things he did was he wrote the dictionaries, the companies who publish them, and told them to take the word nigger out. We ain't going to have that no more. And when you put it in there, all you doing is trying to say it's black people. That ain't the right definition. And so watch that video. Did you see the one that he put his life on the line to spy on a KKK rally? He got caught. He got beat. The next day, he rolled down in front of the KK rally and said, y'all didn't kill me, and I'm coming at you stronger. That one made me cry. The one that the lady said they did a march. I don't know where it was, in Florida or something like that, back in the 70s or so, not long ago. And one of the guys, the black guy, put his gun down in front of the white man and said, I'm not here for nothing but love. You got to shake my hand. And he did. Converted him. Stuff like that. Oh, one more. The lady who integrated the school in Jacksonville, Florida, the high school, she said them white kids did all they could to keep her from graduating with them. Tacks, roaches, rats, all in her seat. One day they beat her up. The principal wouldn't even let her call home. So she staggered across the street to the payphone, called her dad. He came and got her. He said, you ain't got to go back to try to integrate that school. She said, shucks, I'm going back. And she got her PhD now. I'm going to meet that lady next month in the 2025. I want to shake her hand. This is what we do here, Strong Inspirations, all right? And so hit the like button on this video. You're going to love this. This guy's, oh man, it's the real deal, Holyfield. Hit the notifications bell for when the videos come out. You get a ding, a shock, a smoke signal, something to let you know there is new content. And then tell somebody. Don't keep it to yourself. You watching these videos, don't want nobody else to know how astute you are. That makes no sense. Couple more housekeeping. If you may know, I'm a filmmaker. I'm this prolific in my own right. Business in the Black is streaming on Amazon. There were enslaved black people who went to college. I tell you who there were. There were enslaved black people who owned businesses. It's on a film. I wrote a book about it, and that's this. It's America's #1 black business history book. There is nothing like this, and it's very reasonably priced. You can get a bunch of them. And it won't sweat you, you rich people out there. Get you a copy of Business in the Black Business book, my friends. How about this? I wrote a children's book. Start your kids off with this information. It's 30 rich black people in the 1800s. It's on Amazon. I'll tell you where it's at. I got stuff for you. Here, how about this one? It's a calendar for 2025. 12 rich black people, Black history, 365 days a year. One more, my friends, and that's do your best, be your best. You want to hear what Frederick Douglass said, Madam C.J. Walker said, Booker T. Washington, Wilma Rudolph, Maya Angelou? It's in this calendar. Get those. Go to my website, businessintheblack.net. Now, you hear me use this term strong a lot. It's my favorite word. Strong is what I try to be, man. Ladies out there who watching me. And in my world, strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And that is my introduction to the strong soul brother that's on the show today. Good looking guy, too. Y'all gonna like this. PhD, everybody. Come on, brother, introduce yourself. Thank you for being on Strong Inspiration.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Dr. Robert Green II. I'm an assistant professor of history at Claflin University, the oldest HBCU in South Carolina, and I'm also the president of the African American Intellectual History Society. I'm really happy to be on this episode.
Oh, thank you. I heard that, did you? President of this, historian of that. So here we go. We're going to get it on. I got to ask a couple questions about you. Where were you born and raised?
My dad was actually in the Army. So I was born in Frankfurt, Germany, but I was raised in Augusta, Georgia. I grew up there until I was 18 and went to college at Georgia Southern and got my PhD at the University of South Carolina. But I'm very much born and bred in Augusta, Georgia.
Were you born in a black neighborhood and middle class? Can I ask that kind of thing? What was the
Sure.
dynamic of your
Very,
upbringing?
very much. I grew up in very much a black working class neighborhood. And, my family was very much strongly, proudly working class and proudly black as well. And that really shaped my life in a lot of ways.
Um, as a result of where did the you went to all black school, grade school, or was it integrated? What was that
Oh,
dynamic?
they were, well, they were very much integrated, but I'll say they were all majority black. All the schools I went to in Augusta were majority black. Ironically, even though I'm a historian now, the high school I went to was A.R. Johnson High School, which was named after a prominent black educator in Augusta, Georgia, from the late 19th century, Augustus R. Johnson. The high school was actually a magnet high school for health science and engineering students.
Okay.
I was on the engineering track, and then after my first year, realized, yeah, this is a lot of math and science. I am probably not going into engineering, but the school helped shape me in terms of who I am today. But yeah, all the schools I went to were majority black. They certainly were.
Where did the white people live in Augusta compared to the black people?
So that's a really interesting question. In Augusta, most black people live either in East or South Augusta. Most white Augustans kind of live more towards the west side of town, maybe going into North Augusta in South Carolina. But Augusta is very much a majority black city, although it has a large white population as well. But yeah, my life was mostly spent growing up in South Augusta, and some of my relatives live in East Augusta. My mom grew up in East Augusta as well.
Um, does Augusta have any of that racial strife from back in the civil rights era and stuff like that that people maybe do or don't know of?
Well, it's interesting you should mention that because Augusta is one of those places across the South, like a lot of other smaller cities that has its own civil rights history that isn't as well known as other cities. So, for example, although Augusta likes to pride itself on dealing with civil rights early on in the early 60s, it still had a vibrant civil rights movement. As I give you two examples. Um, Martin Luther King Jr. actually came to Augusta about a week before he went back to Memphis the last time for the Memphis campaign. By 1968, Augusta had acquired a reputation for being a place that, while it prided itself on civil rights reform, was actually in the white power structure was very hostile to civil rights. And so when Dr. King came to Augusta, he actually came in secret. It wasn't even announced in advance. And a week after that, unfortunately, he was killed in Memphis. But Augusta always had despite having a powerful black middle class, it had a black movie theater, it had a black business district, and so forth. It had black high schools like Laney High School, for example. There was always a great deal of racial strife under the surface. In 1970, this brings me to my second part of my argument here. In 1970, Augusta actually had a full scale race riot, in which
Oh,
six
really?
people were killed. Yeah, it's actually one of the lesser known race riots of that time period because six people died in the riot. It was actually sparked by the police arresting a black man, beating him while he was in jail. There was a great deal of anger in the community, and it led to a riot which only in the last 10 to 15 years have local Augustans really come to terms with. Historians at Augusta University have started doing more work in terms of interviewing folks who were alive for the riot, helping to bring about a sense of reconciliation in Augusta. But it's still something most folks don't like talking about because it was such a dark day in the city's history. And it happened right around the same time in 1970 as the Kent State Massacre, as the Jackson State Massacre in May of 1970. So the Augusta riot kind of gets glossed over for that reason because it happened around the same time.
I got you. I'm gonna go back on you just a tad. What was the major employer in Augusta? Why did your family move there?
Well,
And before I ask that question, what is the plantation at in your family? Do you know that? And is it in the Augusta area? And then they just kind of went to the bigger city, or what have you? What have you?
so my father's side of the family is from Greene County, Georgia. That's my last name. Um, and my mom's side of the family is from Augusta. On my mother's side, some of them moved to Ohio during the Great Migration and then eventually came back. My dad basically went into the U.S. Army, and that's how he ended up back in Augusta. He was stationed at Fort Gordon at the end of his retirement, and right before his retirement, and that's where I grew up. That's why I grew up in Augusta. My mom is also from Augusta, but both sides of my family tree are very much from Georgia, from the Black Belt region of Georgia. Again, in terms of talking about the longer family histories, a lot of it's based on either Greene County on my dad's side or my mom's side, the greater Augusta area.
Do you know of the like your great grandfather, great grandfather who might have been enslaved? What was their dynamic or anything like that?
I only a little bit. I can't say I know too much, but I will say this. My father has told me stories about hearing from his grandmother about her parents. So those would be my great grandparents, and they're growing up in slavery and the experiences they had, which was eye opening for me because I think a lot of folks think slavery was a long time ago. But there are still people around today who talk to relatives who knew people who were enslaved.
Yeah.
And so he would give me details like when they were enslaved children, they would have to eat out of a trough, like pigs, basically. And that
Oh,
how that
really?
experience, yeah, how that experience really finally shaped them. I don't know too much more in terms of details about that, but again, it is part of our family history.
Yeah. We're gonna go into some more of the story, but for yourself, being astute like you are, growing up, what did the white teachers tell you to go to college? Or did you have black teachers, or and also this is a two-part question. Did the black kids say, "Hey man, you're getting all A's. We don't like that." Did you have to fight through that too?
So, it's interesting you should ask those two questions because I think growing up in Augusta in the 1990s was actually a really important part of my life, in the sense that plenty of my black teachers had grown up and remembered the civil rights. And for them, it was really important to encourage black students to go to college, to get a good education, to do the kinds of things that would help them advance in life. I had some white teachers who saw in me a lot of potential. And certainly they also said you should go to college, you should try to do the best you can. But it was black teachers in particular who were really important in that regard. On the flip side, I never really had a serious issue with other black students saying I was too smart or I was too good for them.
Right.
In fact, what I often found was the opposite, that we were all encouraging of each other.
Okay, cool.
And I think that was helped in part by being in majority black schools, that we weren't as
Yeah.
threatened because we were black. It was more of, okay, we have things we got to get done. Let's go ahead and do them together.
How did you come to like Black history
Oh,
and
it's
choose that as a career choice?
so that's a great question. A large part of that was my father. So, um, as long as I can remember, I enjoyed reading, and I enjoyed reading about Black history. And my father, both my mom and dad encouraged me to read from a very early age. My mom tells me that she read to me when I was very little. It helped foster me a sense of reading. When I was growing up in Augusta, my parents always encouraged me to read the newspaper every day. We read Ebony magazine every month, read Gem magazine, The Barber Shop, that sort of thing. But
Sure.
my father especially, I never forget this. When I was 5 years old, one night he came back from the video store. This is back when we had video stores, and he said, "You got to watch this movie." And it was the film Glory. And I remember watching it with my dad. He made sure I watched it from beginning to end, and he knew I loved history. And he knew in particular I was always intrigued by the histories of Black soldiers and Black soldiers. Because again, my dad was in the army. So in a sense, that was his story too. And watching the film Glory really shaped my life. I saw it when I was very young, and it told me, oh, there's plenty of history out there for me to learn. I think that following year, my grandmother gave to me the Ebony Pictorial History of Black America, the 3-volume encyclopedia set. She had purchased it back in the 1970s when it first came out, and it was just on her bookshelf. You know, most older folk, they have encyclopedias on their bookshelves,
Sure.
even now. And so when my parents go to my grandmother's house, bring me with them, I would sit down and just flip through those books every single time I went there. So one day my grandmother asked me, well, do you want the books? Because nobody else is using them. And I said, sure. You know, I didn't want to take them because I thought they were her books. He said, no, you're going to
Right.
actually use them. I
Right.
still have those books today.
I love
Uh,
it.
so those are influences. And one last thing, my father, when I was growing up in Augusta, would often take me to Hamilton's bookstore. That was the Black-owned bookstore in Augusta. And it was my introduction not just to Black history, but to this larger sense of what Black culture was and is. Seeing all these books by Black authors, seeing all this Black artwork, seeing Black sculptures, etc. It taught me that there was so much more about our people to learn about than what was on television.
Right.
And for that, I really thank my parents for doing
Right. I know I kind of jump around. I got one more jump. Did your father face racism in the military? Did he ever tell you that? Some of those stories? And as a result of him telling you that, you knew that America was a racist society? Did you know that? Because of what he or your mom might have said, and did they have stories?
So, my dad has alluded to racism in the army a handful of times. He never told me directly about what happened to him, but he would sometimes mention in passing that he faced racism. My parents would both mention in passing growing up during the Jim Crow era. So they both remember segregation. They both remember going to segregated schools. But what's interesting about that is that they didn't frame it so much as being oppressed as we were in these all Black environments, and we tried to find ways to thrive in those. So for example,
I
my
love it.
mother,
I love it.
she grew up in Augusta during the 60s, and she recalls going to an all Black movie theater, being in all Black spaces. And she actually said to me once, she wasn't really around a significant number of white people until she was in high school. And by that point, she had been in an all Black world. She didn't really know anything different. And so for them, it was, they acknowledged the problems of Jim Crow segregation. They acknowledged facing racism, but they also acknowledged being in these Black spaces where they could just be themselves. And I think in a lot of ways that shapes the world they lived in, that they view today, and that kind of shaped how I view the world as well.
Well, as a historian, what do you have a specialty?
Yes. So I actually work primarily on a couple of things. 20th century Black and Southern political history and intellectual history. Meaning, in essence, I study number one, how Black people in particular have dealt with Southern politics in the 20th century, just with both Jim Crow and its aftermath, and also how Black folk and Southerners in general have thought about this. In particular, I tend to study from the 1970s on, very recent American history. But in order to really understand that, you have to have a good foundation in early to mid 20th century history as well.
What? How did you choose that as one of the areas? I mean, because there's so many areas. You could have said
Right.
Civil War. You could have said uh, Africa. I mean, so on and so forth. How did that come to be?
Right. Well, it's funny you should say that because, again, I think we'll talk about this in a second. But working at Claflin, I've had to teach a lot of different fields of history, which I really enjoy doing. But what got me into the 1970s and 80s was a couple of things. Number one, knowing that that's the world my parents came of age in, for one. But secondly, historians, we tend to shy away from very recent history until it's about 20, 30, 40 years in the past.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And and for me, the 1970s and 80s are very intriguing because they offer a window into what's happening just after the civil rights and Black power movements come to an end, in terms of how Black people are dealing with restored voting rights power, how they're dealing with the civil rights era and its victories and defeats too. And perhaps most importantly, how they're still dealing with challenges of racism in a society that claims to no longer be racist. That really profoundly shapes my parents' generation, and it certainly shapes my generation as well. So that's what really got me to studying that history. And also, growing up in Georgia in the 90s and 2000s, as we're dealing with debates about the Confederate flag being part of our state flag, as we're dealing with uh, memory of the civil rights movement, as we're dealing with all these things that really symbolize how we as Black Southerners are coming in terms of being in the South at the end of the 20th century, that has really shaped the kind of history that I do.
Okay, with that said, what's the time periods of the civil rights era? Let's say, what's the time periods of what is that dynamic? Okay, what is the area of civil rights period? That's one question. Then I got the other one to go with that.
Right. Okay, so this is a great question that historians actually argue about all the time because I think most people who are listening or viewing your show, when they think of the civil rights movement, they think of roughly 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education, with the murder of Emmett Till, 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, up until maybe at the latest 1968, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But it's worth noting that if you're thinking about civil rights in a broader sense, as in Black Americans fighting for equal access, equal opportunity, and so forth, many historians now say there's actually this idea of a long civil rights movement that begins in the 1930s and 40s, when you've got, for example, the NAACP trying to fight for school desegregation. You've got the Double B campaign during World War II, fighting against fascism abroad, fighting against Jim Crow at home. You've got a bunch of organizations in the late 1940s fighting for civil rights that have been largely forgotten about. And then by 1954, 55, you have the foundation laid for the better remembered civil rights movement. Although I always tell my students at Claflin, never forget that Black folk have been fighting for freedom since we first got here. It's
Yeah,
just
right.
that the civil rights movement is a particular kind of battle for a particular set of rights in the
Okay, let
mid
me
20th
stop you
century.
there. What
Mhm.
is that? What does the civil rights movement mean?
Right. So the civil rights movement, oh man, that's a profound question in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But I think the civil rights movement is essentially Black Americans trying to fight for rights that were guaranteed under the Constitution. Because if you think about civil rights, if you think about, say, the biggest achievements of the movement, three: Brown v. Board of Education, this is 1954, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All of these things basically codified rights and laws that were either already in the Constitution or were already implied by previous legislation. For example, all the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is reinforcing the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, which says that you cannot discriminate against voting rights based on race. Or actually, it says uh, race, ethnicity, et cetera, cannot be used to discriminate against one's voting rights or voting access. Um, Civil rights is really about trying to regain those fundamental rights, which is why right now there are some activists who argue we've got to push for human rights, meaning that there are certain rights that are not guaranteed in the Constitution, like access to health care or economic rights, so on and so forth, that are a bit broader than what we're talking about in the US Constitution. But the civil rights movement was fundamentally about how do we access the rights that are already guaranteed to us under the federal Constitution.
When we talk about that and that time period, who was the president? Or what is there some one body that we can celebrate from a presidential standpoint that really kind of turned the tide and if black folks say we got to look up to this person, this might be that guy that made such a move happen.
Well, before I answer that, I will say that in terms of honoring figures, we always want to remember that these people are human beings. So they were certainly not perfect, far
Right,
from it.
right.
But I think if you're going to look at one president, it would have to be Lyndon Johnson.
Really?
Um,
Okay.
well, and here's why. Because let's go back to Franklin Roosevelt for a second. Let's
Now,
let's
what
go
time is
president by
this?
president, like the 1930s and 40s,
Okay.
the New Deal and World War II. Um, Franklin Roosevelt was the first Democratic president that Black Americans really rallied behind. And that was largely because he did pay some lip service to civil rights during the New Deal era. He had allies like Mary McLeod Bethune, for example, who served uh, in the White House or served alongside folks in the White House. Harry Truman, of course, desegregates the armed forces in
This is after
1948.
this is after him.
Yes, this is after Roosevelt.
Okay.
Um, but I would argue it's Lyndon Johnson because Johnson is the one who pushes for and really uses political muscle to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Both of those happened in large part because of pressure from civil rights activists in the 1950s and 60s. But Lyndon Johnson, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, uses that assassination, he uses the national mood, he uses the Cold War to say, you know what, it's time for us to push for civil rights and voting rights alongside the activism in the streets of America. So I would say, again, with the fact that Johnson was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but he's the president who, arguably more than any other president in the 20th century, does a lot for civil rights.
When we talk about black people and the things that we did to cause our rights to happen, what did they do for Lyndon Johnson to feel the time is right? I mean, were there a lot of protests going on during that era? Did like say Dr. King getting assassinated brought up such a heightened attitude that we not having this more? I remember here in Detroit we had the riot of '67. What did black people do to cause our rights and for them to say, okay, now is the time we got to go for it.
Right. No, that's another wonderful question. Certainly in the 10 years leading up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Black Americans are doing a great deal in several areas. Number one, in the courtroom. NAACP in from the 1930s to the 1950s, the NAACP pursues a legal strategy through the court system where they're trying to argue that the idea of separate but equal, this idea that you can have a black school and a white school that's constitutional as long as they're equal in terms of funding, etc. The NAACP argues that's not happening in the South. That's just simply not happening. It's not allowed to happen. It just can't actually happen. And so by 1954, you get Brown v. Board, which is the culmination of a generation of legal work in the Supreme Court and the federal court system. That's one part of it. But the other part, as you just mentioned, were things like boycotts, were items like protests in the streets. You have organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. They're having sit-ins at lunch counters across the South in the 60s. In 1963, you have the Birmingham campaign, where Dr. King and others decide if we can break the back segregation in Birmingham, which is at the time was notorious as one of the worst segregated cities in the South. If we can break it here, we can really break the back of segregation across the South. When they have that campaign in the successful 1963, that's one of the things that gives President Kennedy and later President Johnson the impetus to finally push for civil rights in 1964. Again, for your audience, think of the timing of this. Um, some historians compare the civil rights movement to a military campaign, where you have to think of it in terms of they're making attacks on segregation in different cities and states across the South.
I got
They're
you.
doing this on purpose. Um, Birmingham was one of those citadels of segregation and racism that they had to attack in 1963 to show that the movement had real strength. That, amongst other things, is what gives Presidents Kennedy and later Johnson the impetus to say, you know what, there is enough grassroots support for civil rights. I mean, after all, the March on Washington in 1963, it happens in August as sort of a punctuation on the earlier Birmingham movement of that summer, where they're showing the national strength of the civil rights movement at the March on Washington. And the following year, you get President Johnson pushing through the Civil Rights Act, and after that, the Voting Rights Act.
Was oh, I gotta give Detroit a plug. I'm in Detroit, everybody.
Oh,
We
definitely.
had the march. We had the march here with Dr. King before the march in Washington D.C. months before, and we had a couple 100,000 people that
Right.
marched in Detroit. Everybody, if you didn't know that, what was this? Was black people tired or of what our condition was that it had just got to a boiling point?
Well, I think it would be more accurate to say, as some activists said in the 60s, they were sick and tired of being sick and tired. Certainly, Black folk have been fighting for civil rights throughout the 20th century in a variety of ways. And like you just said, not just in the South either. Again, I think we got to give Detroit its credit in
Right,
terms of being a bastion of civil rights and Black freedom throughout the 20th century.
right.
Also, cities like Oakland, certainly Harlem, Chicago. Um, but what makes the 60s so different and the civil rights movement so different from earlier eras is that you not only have the culmination of decades of activism, because again, the NAACP had been around for 50 years. You had National Urban League around for like 40 years at that point. You had plenty of folks been involved in the struggle for a long time. There is also a second critical factor here, which is the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The reason that's important is that by the mid 60s, Black activists and their allies could say to the federal government, if you guys are not concerned about civil rights, we know who else is, the rest of the world. And indeed, by the 60s, you also have new nations being born in Africa. I'll give you a quick story about this.
Okay.
In 1957, Ghana gains its independence from Great Britain under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. In 1957, they have their Independence Day celebration. At that time, Richard Nixon was the vice president. He goes to Ghana. Dr. King and Coretta Scott King also go to Ghana as part of this American delegation to Ghana. Vice President Nixon is talking to a group of what he assumes are Ghanaians. And he says, well, how does it feel to be free? One person responds in like a light Southern accent, we would know we're from Alabama. The point being that you had
Mm,
Black folk who were going around the world. For one, you had a lot of folks, like quite a few folks from Africa who were part of the colonization movement, the fight for freedom in Africa, had gone to HBCUs in the US. They had seen what the US was like up close. Um, and so the US government understood that during the Cold War, as they're trying to get the support of nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, that one of the biggest impediments to that support was people seeing how bad racism was in America. And so,
okay, I
in
love it.
part, the federal government had to start getting serious about civil rights to show the world actually we're going to live up to our creed of liberty and justice for all. That's another big factor
I love it.
in the civil rights era.
And so that leads to the question this. You know how we fought against apartheid in South Africa, and that happened
Right.
many years after the civil rights had ended in America. And you know, some of the powers that be said you got to divest from the corporations that are put money in South Africa. Was the world saying that about America at that time? We don't like what you're doing, and so we're going to divest. We're going to talk about you. Whatever, whatever.
Well, I think the problem there was the United States was just simply too powerful for that to happen. But to that point, I'm glad you mentioned the anti-apartheid movement. What you did see in the 50s and 60s were attempts by Black activists to bring the problem of Jim Crow segregation to the United Nations. I'll give you two examples. In 1951, there was a book written called We Charge Genocide. It was a book written by a collection of Black activists. If you go online, you can just find a PDF of it right now and read it, where they list things like police brutality, lynchings, and so forth. And their argument was the United Nations has an official definition of genocide. They argued the United States was committing genocide against Black Americans. This is 1951. Over a decade later, Malcolm X is saying the same thing. In 1963, 64, he's saying we should bring to the United Nations charges of genocide against the federal government of the United States for treatment of Black people. In both cases, those attempts fell short, in part because of U.S. pressure on the UN. But your point, I think, is well taken that while there was never a serious global movement for divestment from America, there was certainly plenty of pressure being brought by leaders in Africa and elsewhere to say, well, what's going on in America should matter to all of it. I think also another example of this is during the Vietnam War, where the North Vietnamese would actually mention, in terms of global propaganda, the United States was again still a racist society at home. In fact, when they were fighting American troops in the field, there were stories from the 60s of Vietnamese soldiers intentionally only targeting white soldiers in the field, leaving black soldiers alone at
Oh, is
various
that
points.
right? Oh, okay.
Um, and this
Okay.
is from the book Blood, which is an oral history of the Vietnam War for black soldiers. But in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, in Asia in particular, you often have propaganda saying to black soldiers, why fight for a racist society against other colored people? So again, your point about the global issues of racism is very important, very valid to think about.
What was it? Was there some noted news article in a European newspaper that people point to says that's the article that really kind of sparked all this international outcry against America?
Well,
Anything like that that comes to mind?
I can't point to one article, but what I can say is civil rights protests at home received extensive coverage from European news sources. For example, um, when you think about Little Rock Nine, the Little Rock
Yeah.
Black Students Integrated Central High, there were European reporters who were there covering. There were Europeans covering a the gamut of civil rights activism in the 50s and 60s. And so you got to remember that this is during a time of not only newspapers, but also radio and television. And so a lot of the images you see of civil rights protests in America were being broadcast all over the world. I mean, for example, there's a
Okay.
story of James Baldwin. When he leaves America in the late 40s and goes to France, what spurs him to come back to America is seeing a French newspaper with an image of civil rights activism in the Deep South in the 1950s. And that tells him, I got to go back home. You have other news stories going around the globe where people are talking about civil rights in a way that makes it clear this is front page news all around the world. Europe, in Asia, and especially Africa. African news sources were extensively covering the civil rights movement as well.
Earlier you said you also talked about the dynamic, what happened after the era. So once they, for example, the day of Lyndon Johnson signing the bills, the voting rights and Brown versus Board, what's the sentiment in America at that time? Is there parties all over the country? Is that noted? The jubilation that okay, we have accomplished something.
Yes, and with both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, there was a sense, on the one hand, of jubilation, especially amongst Black Americans, but there was also a sense of there's more work to be done, in particular with the Voting Rights Act. So The Voting Rights Act is signed August of 1965. And about a week later, you have the riots in Watts, Los Angeles, which really brought home, oh, there's still a lot of work for us to be, a lot of work to be done beyond the South. For one thing. I think secondly, with both of those bills, while Black people were really happy with both bills, they also understood something I always tell my students at Claflin and elsewhere, which is it is one thing for a bill to be passed. It is one thing for there to be an amendment to the Constitution. It is another for the federal government to enforce those things.
Yeah, I was going to get into that.
And,
Yeah.
and so what they were really watching was, okay, let's see what they actually do when these bills are on the books, like will they actually enforce them? And certainly when the Johnson later with Jimmy Carter, you do see actual enforcement of those laws. But again, for Black people, it was a sense of relief. You didn't quite have, at least as far as I know, you didn't quite have massive street parties, but there was a large sense of, okay, we can finally start doing the kinds of things we wanted to do this entire time.
When you say that they had to enforce it, what were some of the measures that they took? Because understandably, when we had the right to vote back in the Reconstruction period, and then when that ended, now they put in poll tax and all these other things that made it where you almost half the society couldn't read or couldn't have passed the tax the test to vote. What did they do? Did they do certain things? Did the government put in policies that said um, and issues that people who did not comply had to face jail time or otherwise? Governmental entities, that kind of thing.
So that's a great question, and this is, I think, part of the story that gets left out, but is very important. So number one, I'm glad you mentioned Reconstruction because in a lot of ways, Reconstruction was our one of our first civil rights movements. Historians and activists alike refer to the civil rights era as the second Reconstruction for that reason. In fact, you asked about what folks can read. If you about this era, Google Books has most of the back issues of Ebony magazine from this time period. If you go online, and you can read them there. And in particular, if you look at 1963, 64, 65, up to like 68, Ebony magazine almost every single month is talking about the comparisons between the Reconstruction period and the Civil Rights era, for one. Secondly, in terms of enforcement, I don't want folks to forget about one important part of the Constitution. In 1964, in addition to Congress passing the Civil Rights Act, um, the Constitution had added to it the 24th Amendment, which banned the poll tax. We kind of gloss over that part, but the
Okay,
poll
I love
tax
it.
was also banned around the same time. This was really important because, to your point about enforcing these laws, the problem with the poll tax and things like it is that the poll tax did not explicitly mention race. Everybody had to pay the poll tax, but they understood in the 1890s that most Black folk who were sharecroppers at the time could not pay the poll tax. By the way, it's worth noting too that a lot of white Southerners lost the right to vote because of the poll tax too, because they couldn't afford it either. But by the 60s, the federal government, the Department of Justice, set up a mechanism to really enforce these laws. The Voting Rights Act was basically enforcing the 15th Amendment. They were targeting Southern states because they had a history of racism and discrimination on voting rights and so forth. And so the federal government used the Justice Department, used the FBI, they used these initiatives to really enforce these laws. But again, this is kind of waxed and waned over the last 60 years. Some administrations would enforce them more than others.
Was there some area, some state that fought against it the most? Like a southern state or otherwise, that they were the last to agree, even in the voting of it or anything like that. That we can
So,
give them a shout out for how bad they
well,
are or
well,
something.
I will say living in South Carolina for 12 years now, working here for a long time. South Carolina was persistent in trying to oppose the Civil Rights Act of 64. They actually challenged it in the court system, I think, before anybody else did. But eventually the Supreme Court ruled, no, Civil Rights Act is constitutional. That's it. There's nothing else you can do about it. With voting rights, it's a little bit different where the greater question was, how do we encourage Black folk who hadn't had the right to vote for generations to finally get out and vote. And so you have things like the Voter Education Project going to southern states to really help folks not only know their rights as voters, but also register to vote, know what the voting mechanisms were like, and so forth. I mean, it took time. Like it was not, again, to your earlier question about celebrating the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, for Black folk, it was more of, okay, these acts have been passed. Let's roll up our sleeves and actually properly utilize.
Is there a point in time that we could say um, was the moment where the most number of black people voted? That's my first question, especially since we just come off this election. Can we say
Mhm.
that when that happened, there were more black people that voted for in the history of America than any other time period?
Well, I will say that what you see by the early 1970s, that the Voter Education Project throughout the South, led by folks like John Lewis, for example, James Felder here in South Carolina, et cetera, you had by 1972, 74, millions of new Black voters across the South.
Okay.
And they were making a huge difference on a local and state level. I think that when we talk about voting rights, we tend to focus on presidential election, which is understandable. But really, the revolution in Black voting rights in the 60s and 70s had a bigger impact on local and state elections in the South. So, for instance, you see Black mayors being elected, you see Black sheriffs being elected, Black aldermen, city councilmen, et cetera. You also see Black people going to Congress from the South for the first time, again, since Reconstruction. In 1972, you have Andrew Young going to Congress from Georgia, and the first Black woman in Congress, Barbara Jordan, going to Congress from Texas. That's
Okay.
all due to the fact that you have so many new Black voters on the voter rolls. And I think since then, you've had largely strong Black political participation in national and state elections. But again, it does wax and wane over time. I think if you're going to look at a period where Black voting strength was at its highest, arguably it was in 2008 and 2012 with Barack Obama running for president. That's when you really see Black voting power at its highest in many ways. But it has waxed and waned over the last 60 years or so.
Well, is the '60s the best time in Black America?
Oh man, that is wow. I see. I would actually argue. Hmm,
When
that
those
is that is
bills got passed, is that
I would say in terms of post Civil War, or post Reconstruction, I would say 60s going into the 70s, yes, because I think not only is it about the bills that were passed, it's also about the potential that was there. You have all this energy amongst younger civil rights activists. You have all this energy from Black Power activists too. You have all these ideas across the country. You've got Martin Luther King Jr., Michael X, Kwame Ture, Fannie Lou Hamer, Angela Davis, so many other folks who were all out there offering these very exciting and fascinating visions of what not only what Black life is, but what Black life could be. And so I think that makes the 60s and 70s so exciting to look at and to watch. Was it the best time period? I think you might be on to something. Now, I'm personally biased. I grew up in the 1990s, so I kind of think that was the best time period in some ways to be Black, although we had problems then too. But there was so much energy and enthusiasm in the air in the 60s and 70s in Black America that I don't think we've ever fully recaptured since.
yeah? Because I mean, we had the "I'm Black and I'm Proud." That's the
Right.
James Brown time when he's singing that song, and some of those other I don't know, maybe I don't know if I say Gil Scott Heron, but some of those
Oh
others,
yeah, definitely.
that were singing those songs, especially that
Hmm.
"I'm Black and I'm Proud." The Marvin Gaye might have been that time period or something like that. You just alluded, and before we come to a close, I want to ask this. You said the '90s. Why? What happened in the '90s that you
Well,
so excited about?
so I think the 90s, in addition to the era when I was growing up as a kid, as a child, a young adult, I think also the 1990s were really interesting in Black America because that was the first generation of Black folk to grow up after segregation was over, um, which meant that there were more opportunities open to us. But that's also, in a lot of ways, sort of cut off by the fact that in the 90s, you have the war on drugs, you have the urban crisis, you have Black Americans trying to figure out how do we navigate a world where deindustrialization has happened, where so many of our major cities have lost funding and investment. And so there's a sense of opportunity, but there's also a sense of opportunity lost as well. With that said, I think the 90s is really intriguing because you have older Black Americans looking back in the 60s and 70s and trying to recapture some of that Black is beautiful spirit. So, for instance, you have films like Glory coming out, Malcolm X coming out, so many Black sitcoms, Black film, Black
Right.
books, etc.
I got you.
There is a sense that there's a lot of work for us to be done as Black folk in America.
Just a couple more. When we compare America on a global scale, we went through our civil rights, as you say, in the 60s and so on and so forth. And then, the glorious years of the 90s. Well, let's compare that to maybe in Europe, if you may. Well, I don't think that they didn't have a civil rights era in let's say London per se. Is that your take, or
Well,
is America are other countries behind us if they had a fight?
so that's actually a really intriguing question because in the 60s, there are two nations in particular that stand out on this subject, Britain and France, because of their overseas empire, right? So Britain in particular in the 50s and 60s is dealing with the loss of its empires in Africa and the Caribbean. And what's happening in the post World War II years in Britain is that because of a massive shortage of labor in Britain, they were asking folks from the Caribbean to move to
Right.
Great Britain to work.
That,
It's called
right.
the Windrush generation.
Right.
Um, by the 60s, however, it's becoming a combination immigration and civil rights issue. For instance, Malcolm X visits London in 1964. He participates in an Oxford debate at Oxford Union. Um, he encounters the Conservative Party running advertisements saying, and I'm just kind of cleaning up the language here, if you want a black person for your neighbor, vote labor, right? So they're having to confront racism there. It's not quite the same kind of civil rights movement, but there is a movement for black freedom in Britain in the 60s and 70s that is drawing a lot of inspiration from both decolonization in Africa and also civil rights in America. In France, on the other hand, what you also have there is them dealing with the fall of their empire in Africa as well, where in France they're having to deal with Algerians, also folks from Senegal, other parts of sub-Saharan Africa moving to France, and they're having a difficult time absorbing that population because in France it's more of we don't they're trying to be colorblind, but racism is very much endemic in their society. So it's not quite a civil rights movement, but they're dealing with some similar questions over there too.
This is plug time. Have you written a book?
Well, I do have a book out now. A co-edited book with Professor Tyler D. Perry of UNLV. It's called Invisible No More: The African American Experience at University of South Carolina. You can still get it now wherever books
You
are
don't have a
sold.
copy to show us, do you?
Not right with me at the moment, unfortunately.
Okay.
Um, but the book is about the history of Black folk at USC. And most folks hear that and assume, oh, it's about segregation. It is, but what makes USC unique is that it was the only Southern university during Reconstruction that had both Black and white students at it. It had Black students there from 1873 to 1877. In fact, it had Black students and Black faculty there. It was the most radical university around at that
Is
time.
that right?
And so our book gets into that. Our book gets into the enslaved at South Carolina before that. And the book ends by talking about Black students at USC since the 60s, because I think one of the stories that's often left out is that what happens when a school desegregates is not just that Black students are welcome, it's that they have to fight to make space for themselves on
Right.
that campus as well.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm working on my own book about, it's called the Newest South. It is all about the Democratic Party trying to cultivate Black voters across the country in the 1970s and 80s. Again, taking the assumption that the black vote was for the Democratic Party to take for granted and turning it on its head, saying actually Democrats understood and should still understand now that black voters, if they are taken seriously, can be a powerful vote, a powerful voice for change. But if they're taken for granted, then that could lead to electoral disaster. So that's what my book is all about.
We look forward to that, and you're more than welcome to come back here anytime.
Oh,
Just one
definitely.
more question, and we got to plug this in. What's the college like? Clapton College? Where is it? Give us a little history on the school.
Oh,
Let's get some more students there. Whatever, who might watch this.
so Claflin University is located in Orangeburg, South Carolina.
Which is where? Let
It,
me stop you there. Where is that near? What big city?
okay, so Orangeburg is about 45 minutes away from Columbia, about maybe roughly under 2 hours away from Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay.
Um,
How do you
and
get there? Can you fly where to get to
oh, well, most of the time you have to fly into either Columbia or Charleston and then drive to Orangeburg to get there.
all right.
Um, I'm sure some of your listeners that they follow college football are more familiar with South Carolina State University, who will be playing, I believe, the Celebration Bowl. Um, SC State and Claflin are side by side. Claflin is old. Claflin was founded in 1869. It is the oldest HBCU in South Carolina. It's one of the oldest HBCUs in the country. It's it has been a strong liberal arts school for well over a century and a half. It has produced a plethora of artists, teachers, and preachers, and other fields as well. But Claflin, we have a proud history of arts, culture, literature, also science and technology now as well. And we really pride ourselves in on being a jewel in Orangeburg. Orangeburg is a very small town, but it has two HBCUs, us and SC State. In fact, Claflin and SC State are divided by a fence. And
Oh, really?
we joke with our colleagues across the fence at SC State that we want our land back because SC State was actually founded on land that once belonged to Claflin. Um, but we are two proud HBCUs in the heart of South Carolina. And again, we encourage folks to come down. Claflin is still we're a private Methodist university. SC State is public, but we strongly encourage folks to come to Claflin. We have a lot of students from South Carolina, but we also have a lot of students from North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, up the old Great Migration route going to the north. And our students are proud Claflinites. So
Yeah,
we're
y'all
on
have
a
a football
hilltop high.
team and basketball team.
Well, so we had football until 1964,
Okay.
and we haven't had it since. Although we joke that we are undefeated in football since the 60s. So there is
Okay.
that for us. We
Okay.
have everything else. We have sports, but I think we're most proud of our music tradition. We have a choir that travels all over the world.
Oh,
Uh,
really? Love
we have a variety of student organizations like anybody else. But
it.
we have, in particular, a strong tradition in art. We produce artists like Leo Twiggs, Arthur Rose,
Yes.
photographers like Cecil Williams. So we really take pride in education in class.
Okay. Guess another one. We're gonna plug the city. Well, is there a festival in the city to come to? I mean, I know the homecoming is
Yes,
probably big, what have you. But is there a festival when if you, hey, put this on your to-do list over the summer or something like that?
yes. So we do have an Orangeburg festival every year that takes place in the fall. We do have that. We of course also have homecomings for both universities in the fall. But I will plug one other thing for Claflin. Every April we have what's called Calabash, which is Claflin Arts and Letters. It's our celebration of the humanities and liberal arts at Claflin. We've had it every April for the last, I think, 10 to 11 years now. And it's our way of saying that the university still takes pride in art, literature, and culture in general, which is, again, a really important and integral part of the Black experience in America. We kind of emphasize that at Claflin too.
I love it. Well, hey man, I thank you so much for coming on the show. I do this with everybody. One more. Is there a question I have not asked you? Something that anything that comes to mind?
Well, I guess not really a question, but I guess more of like, how else do I do history beyond my university?
definitely,
And I,
definitely.
I want to one last plug in.
Yeah.
I also am the lead instructor of what's called the Majeska Simpkins School of Human Rights. It's essentially a freedom school that we have every spring and summer, where we teach about 15 weeks or so every Monday night. I'll do a class on the history of South Carolina, but it is a people's history from the point of view of the grassroots. So it talks about the enslaved, talks about Black folk, the poor, indigenous people, etc. I've been doing that since 2019. The South Carolina Progressive Network has been sponsoring it since 2015. And it's one of the things I'm most proud of doing here in South Carolina, because South Carolina has a rich history of activism and protest and radicalism that most folks within the state don't know about, much less folks outside the state. So that Modjeska Simpkins School is named after Modjeska Simpkins. She was a longtime radical activist here in South Carolina. She lived to be about 93 years old, and she was one of the great firebrands of our state in the 20th century.
Yeah, I got to plug this other one I didn't ask you. Just kind of, you're also the president of this that other association. Tell us a little
Right.
bit about it too.
So the African American Intellectual History Society we're going to have our 10th anniversary conference in 2025 in Providence, Rhode Island. But it is an organization of academics and historians who study African American intellectual history. In other words, we study the thoughts and ideas that Black folk put to paper in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Really thinking about how Black people have conceptualized not only being Black, but have thought about what does it mean to be Black in America, in the Western world, etc. A friend of mine once said that intellectual history is really the history of anybody who had a thought, basically. The question becomes whose thoughts are privileged. In our organization, we're really trying to focus on Black people, whether they're from Africa, from the Americas, throughout the diaspora, and asking the question, how did they think about being Black in their time?
I love it. Okay, a couple more. Websites of the association, any websites that you want us to know about.
Sure. So I will say first that aihs.org is the best way to get more information about our organization. We
Okay.
also have a blog called Black Perspectives, which is an award-winning blog. So if you want to read more Black intellectual history, go to Black Perspectives. Also, I would like to plug a podcast called Our New South. It is a podcast I co-host with Kevin Blackistone of ESPN. It is a podcast that is out of the Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, and we talk about what the South is in the 21st century. So those are a couple that I would like to plug right now. And if you're interested in the Modjeska Simpkins School, you can just check out scpronet. That's scpronet.org to find more information about the Modjeska Simpkins School.
Yeah, we're gonna put all that in the description, everybody. And so, thank you for being on the show, uh, Brother Green, and and
Thank you
and
for
and,
having me.
and Doctor Green, and all them other Greens. And oh, yo, I got that. You said the town is named after your last name.
Well, yeah. So my dad's from Greene County, Georgia, specifically Greensboro, Georgia. And so you can kind of get where my last name comes from. That's named after the slave holder in the area.
Yeah, that's royalty right there in itself.
Right.
Strong inspirations, everybody. Well, we give it to you, and I just do my very best to ask intelligent questions and let the guest do the talking, and he did it so eloquently. So I'm excited about that. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. There is no love button. Hit the notifications bell for when the videos come out. You get a ding, a shout. You know what you get. Come on now. And then tell somebody about strong inspirations. Go to the websites that he talked about. And if you want them intellectual kind of historian type people, join the association. I suspect y'all want members of
Oh,
college.
definitely,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. It'll be all on the description. And to you, go to my website, businessintheblack.net. Get you a calendar, get you a book, watch a movie. Come, I'm speaking around the country, telling it what I call good Black history. And to you, my brother, I say this, and I mean this with all sincerity. I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. I love who you become because you sat there and you read them books and you took hold of that, and then you said, "Oh man, that engineering might not be, but I can be more effective if I go with the history of my people so that I can understand and then tell others what I have come to find. And you do that in that university setting, and I'm sure when you speak and in that organization, that's a beautiful thing. Did your parents get a chance to see you get the doctorate and all that?
Right. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. They're
They
very,
did
very
cool.
proud
I
of
know they
me.
was like, "That's my son up on stage." I know they did, because you can't get no higher than that. You don't need no more papers. That is it.
Definitely.
Thank you so much. And so I say, uh, I'll be in touch, everybody. You know what we do. Bye bye. We out.